Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today. All you who registered and a few gate crashers, we're happy to have you. I'm Kathy Weiland and I'm the Matamidi Community Education Director, and we're just delighted to host this event. And I want to hand it over to Jordan, who will take care of our blessing. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Bonjour, my name is Jordan Zickerman, and I am the Indian Education Program Lead at White Bear Lake Area Schools. And today, I would like to start by blessing our space. Today, we give thanks to the Creator for what we have been given. We give thanks for the sky above and the earth below, the rising sun and the moon. We give thanks for the beauty in our surroundings and for our growing, diverse community. We give thanks to our parents, brothers, sisters, friends, and the laughter of our children. We give thanks for the love in our hearts. Creator, may you bless this space and continue to bless our community while looking over us. Miigwech.
It's an honor to be here today to have this session. We're thrilled that when we proposed this series of sessions that we had a good response. So we did one evening program that was similar to this at the White Bear Lake District Center, and now today we are here at the Matamidi District Center, and it's fun to have a big crowd. So thank you all for being here and joining us. So essentially what we hope to accomplish through these sessions, or through today anyway, is an honoring of our legacy as a community, a recognition of our past, and the various and complex interactions that have and still play a role in who we are as a larger group. We approach this work with an attitude of respect and humility. There's much to be learned from our past for each of us. Today's session is intended to be a starting point, just like all of them, both taking us back as far as we can with the story of our land and the human inhabitants of our area, and bringing that impact forward to today. So it's a place for us to start and tell the story, and we'll hear pieces of the land itself from Jim Lane with the tree cookie that we'll be discussing. That is a phenomenal artifact in its own right, and stories of the people and the impact of the people on our land, and carry that forward. But it's not an ending point. It's not we've told that story, now we're finished. We will be carrying these stories through all of these series as we go. So with each session we will add more layers and attempt to bring that collective story further into the present. The White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, as I mentioned, has coordinated these presentations to lay the groundwork for the conversations and the series to continue. And as the executive director, I am equipped to share from the historical perspective, and have the honor of being joined, as I mentioned, by members of our community who can share from their own personal perspectives on our past as examples of the varied and complex experiences and resources that make up our community. One of the things that we really want to point out and talk about today and throughout these is that every individual story is unique. The story of a group, whether it is defined by ethnicity, religion, citizenship, race, or another label, is made up of individual stories of the members of that group. So your story will be very different from your story, even though there are similarities, or my story would be different from the story of my parents or my siblings, although we have common ground, if you will. We all have individual experiences and pieces that piece those together. And that is the same for any larger group that we look at. So not one story, well, not one version can tell the story of any piece. So, as such, this three-part series, because we have two other continuing in the winter and the spring, will touch on examples of stories from our area over the centuries, beginning today with the Dakota and the Ojibwe, and continuing this winter with the largely European-based immigrants who came in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and followed next spring with the post-World War II population surge, with the more recent arrivals, primarily from Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Central America. So my background and training is in historical research. I tend to, for those who are familiar with me, I tend to love to dive into documents and photographs and things like that. When you start looking at the Dakota and Ojibwe history of Minnesota in particular, there are resources, absolutely, but not that go back far enough as far as I'm concerned, from a written standpoint or from a document standpoint. And so it's difficult to dig deeply in some of those cases. It's interesting because one of the things that we get to do today with the tree cookie is talk about what the land itself how it's speaking to us. And so we will jump into that. One of the other clues, or one of the other pieces that helps us inform us on the impact that the early peoples of Minnesota have had on this community or this area are the place names. And so up here, you're not meant to be able to read the map, so don't panic. But up here we have a map of the hydrographical basin of the upper Mississippi by Joseph Nicolet. Now this is one of the earliest maps of this area that is Minnesota. You can see Lake Superior up here, the Mississippi River and other areas. Of course, this is pre-Minnesota. This is pre-Minnesota territory even. And throughout this map, it's one that's been studied greatly, but throughout this map, there are place names that are either actual attempts to capture indigenous names and to actually record those, or there are place names that are translations. For example, we have Bears Lake. This is a close-up of one of those, of part of that map. We have Bears Lake here on the map. That is meant to be White Bear Lake. There are a lot of variations on how that came to be, why that came to be as Bears Lake on the map. The fact that it is included on the map in any way is significant. Of course, we call it White Bear Lake today, and of course we call Matamidi, which also means Mato, roughly meaning bear, Midai or Midday, meaning lake or water. Both mean Bear Lake, or pieced together to become that, at least in some translations. There are a lot of discussions, and I frankly have a lot to learn about this particular map and what more it can tell us, because some of the sections are incredibly well detailed. Our area is a little less specific, and clearly not that they had the same surveyors' tools and things that they have today by any means, but clearly the shape is a little bit off. The lake has changed, but probably not quite that much in its shape over the years. But the fact that we made it onto the map in the 1840s is fairly significant. This was a known place. This was a known and named place, and so that's an important piece. Throughout this area are many of those known and named places. And of course, Minnesota as a whole, in general, what we know today as Minnesota, was created through the heaving and the melting of glaciers, the formation of glaciers, creating an assortment of land features, including, of course, our many rivers, our many lakes. We're well known for those lakes, but also areas of rocky and sandy soil, areas of fertile soil for farming that were good for farming. Minnesota itself is a wonderful microcosm of exactly that, because you get the fields and the plains and the things to the south, and the rocky, sandy, challenging terrain in many ways to the north. And it's exactly those landscapes that attracted people through the centuries. It's still those landscapes that attract people. We are working to create a bike path around White Bear Lake. It's something that draws people. One of the goals of that is to bring people to the community and make it a place where people want to live, because they want to be out by that lake and by that water. We have many sailors and fishing people and all sorts of other folks who come. And it was exactly that same way centuries ago, not necessarily from a recreational standpoint, but those features provided amenities, provided food, provided resources. As we go throughout this three-part series, this is a theme that you will hear about again and again. With a thorough understanding of the land, the indigenous people made a seasonal migration through this region, spending much of the winter season hunting and living in the more wooded areas, and trapping and maple sugaring in the spring season. Villages were established in the warmer season and were often at known places and reused year after year. So it wasn't just a random migration, it was certainly a pattern. The Dakota and the Ojibwe, who had migrated west from the Sault Ste. Marie area and the Chequamegon region near Lake Superior, have lived together for generations in what would become Minnesota. As with any relational dynamic where two groups live in close proximity, things were not always peaceful. But both the Dakota and Ojibwe had a view of the land not as a possession, but as a living entity, and treated the land as a relative or a being. The region just to the north of our area is often referred to as the middle ground. A fluctuating area whose boundaries changed as the seasons and the conditions changed. So if food was scarce, that transitional space could shift to areas that had more resources. If food was abundant, it might shift further south or further north. Things became much more complex when European contact brought a view of the boundaries and the land ownership, which were applied to this area and restricted people to remain within certain geographic locations. In other words, instead of having the freedom to sort of sort it out and make things flow, different types of rules were applied and things got complicated quickly. The introduction of alliances between indigenous people and fur trade companies or indigenous people and military units occurred, which often created imbalances and ever-changing relationships. The dynamics changed and the friction between various groups increased, creating complex relationships. And that's complex is one of the key words throughout all of these discussions because things are never simple, just like within our own families, our own communities, neighborhoods, and that sort of thing. One physical link to the past that I have been very aware of throughout my tenure at the Historical Society are the burial mounds at White Bear Lake. There were several burial mounds along Lake Avenue for many, many years, and today there's only one that remains. But the largest mound, most were destroyed due to lack of understanding or lack of knowledge. One was very specifically, consciously taken out, the largest mound that sat here. This mound was incredibly significant. It stood 84 feet long, or 80 to 84 feet long, and about 12 to 15 feet wide, and was a very important site. It is often believed that mound sites were generally built near village sites, and we do not know specifically of a village site around the White Bear area, and I'm not certain how close they were necessarily had to be, but it intrigues me that we have a concentration of mounds along the west shore of the lake, and not a known village site at this point in the near vicinity. So it's one of those, again, pieces that we need to continue to try to understand. The mounds, of course, were man-made. They're a man-made physical link to our past, but there were many ways that the land itself, as I've said, can talk to us and share its story, and that, of course, of the humans who have inhabited it through the years.
Please don't eat the tree cookies. I know there's one group. I do need to use these again, and the teeth marks make it harder to use. Yeah, as Sarah said, I use the tree cookie, and the tree cookie she's referring to is this one right here, which I implore all of you to come and at least come and touch and see and feel it. It's very touch-friendly, so please come and look at it. With regards to history, when you touch this tree, you are touching carbon that was sequestered from the atmosphere 250 years ago. So when you touch this, you're touching a piece of the environment, quite literally, locked away in the wood of this tree. So with that, let's go over here. Sorry, I'm a walker, so I'm not going to stay in one spot. So you're going to have to keep up with me. So you might be asking why a science teacher is here talking about the history of the land. Well, when I started teaching here at Matamidi High School about 7 years ago, I was given the task of teaching environmental science. And environmental science is traditionally, you talk about what people do. So you talk about power plants and energy and stuff like that. You're more or less told to tell the kids what they need to think. That's not how I roll. When I teach, I want to get my kids outside. If I'm going to teach them environmental science, I want them to be in the environment that they are learning about. So the number one thing that I did is I started something called my tree project, where around the high school we are very grateful to have a couple of large woodlots with very large trees. And these kids, most of them grow up in Matamidi, and they walk by these trees every single day. And all they ever see is trees. They don't see the forest. And the goal of this project is to get them to change their paradigm from just a bunch of trees to be able to see it as a dynamic, historical context of this living, breathing environment. So what I challenge them to do is to get outside in the dead of winter and identify trees, which, how would most of us identify trees? With the leaves. So I say, we took all the leaves off, now you have to tell me the difference between a bur oak and a white oak. Or, well, I don't tell them that, they figure that out. So here they are. This was a couple years ago. This is buckthorn, so that's the one that they all learn very, very quickly. And then there they are engaging with the tree cookie there. This brings into the story of the grandmother oak here. It's a bur oak. Bur oak are the slowest growing of all of the oaks. So white oaks are fairly slow growing. Red oaks grow relatively quickly. But bur oaks they're the ancient ones. This particular oak was approximately 260 years by my count. It was located right on Moorhead Ave and Lake Ave in White Bear Lake, and the branch that you see here pointed right towards Manitou Island. So this is a very significant tree. It has quite a bit of history going back 260 years. That predates our nation, that predates our state, that predates any European people in this area. So that tree, if you think about it, a wayward squirrel that was burying an acorn for winter some 300-ish years ago, buried an acorn, forgot about it, and it turned into this tree. And that's a story in and of itself. The reason bur oaks are so slow growing is they are very drought resistant, so they put their time in growing slowly so that they can resist drought. Fires, they're very fire resistant as well. They're also found in prairie savanna areas. So that tells you something about, if there's a bur oak there, that probably wasn't a forest. It was more of an open area with grasses and probably an oak savanna typed ecosystem. All right, now it is your turn. I would like you guys to take a look. This is the #1 question that I ask for my students, and you would be surprised. So if you know the answer, don't shout it out. Which ring is the oldest? This is how I start my tree project, because you have to get first things first. And we have this ring here, and we have this ring here. So which one is the oldest? The other thing I'd like you to do is everybody take your tree cookie at your table, and everyone take a look. See if you can figure out, looking at the information on your tree cookie, which one is the oldest ring and which one is the newest ring. And if you think you know the answer, don't just shout it out. See if you can get other people's perspectives.
First time you thought of it, you may not be so happy. But you might think, it's older going back here.
Oh, did you guys not get a cookie? Oh, okay, okay. Take another 10 seconds for your conversation. Okay, let's come back together here. Oh, they're excited. Sorry to ruin the fun. So does anybody think they have evidence to support their claim? Now, some of you are like, well, I just know it. But is there evidence in the tree cookie, either at your table or on the board, that you could use to support your claim of which ring is the oldest, this one or that one? Does anybody want to share? Sure, right in the back there.
I taught younger kids science. The outside phloem and xylem move the food up and down. So I'm thinking if it's on the outside, the center ring would be the oldest and would move outward.
Okay, so
I may have been wrong all those years.
based on prior experience, there's this phloem and xylem. That's think of it as like the pipes that pump sugar and water up and down the tree, and that's on the outside of the tree. Okay. Does anybody have something physical that they can see on their tree cookie that might be able to infer? Sure, right up front.
Well, the bark starts to split as the branches or the trunk get larger, so I would think it would be the outside ring would be the oldest.
Okay. So is there evidence on your cookie? Because that could mean that they're putting more wood on the inside and pushing everything out versus going on the out?
The grooves, the spreading of the bark, I guess, would be an indication.
Okay. Anybody else?
there's an embedded branch in this one,
Okay,
so conceivably healed around the outside.
so showing evidence that it moved. Now, is that showing that it grew out from the inside?
Around.
Or it grew around it?
From the outside.
Okay. You guys just so desperately want me to tell you the answer now. Yeah, over here.
There's evidence of physical damage at one point that would come from the outside of the tree, and now it's in the middle, so.
Okay. Yeah, and this might sound common sense to some of you, but this is a very real misconception. In some classes, up to half the class, they don't know. And it leads to this very interesting conversation for how does a tree actually grow? Because it's very counterintuitive. The correct answer is, you wait for it. Oh, we're going. It grows from the outside out. And so it's putting on, if you think about this in 3 dimensions, it's putting on a cone of new wood every single year. So the oldest ring is here and the newest ring is here. The tree's only alive right on the outside. And that's very counterintuitive to think about. And all of the evidence that you supplied is valid evidence. I'd like to touch on the idea that the trees get, the bark splits. What does a young tree look like? What does the bark look like on a young tree? It's smooth. As they get older, they get wrinkles. That is all tree bark is. It is the tree's skin, and as they get older, they show their age. They wrinkle their skin. So, I mean, if you want to think about it that way, these trees really are our elders. And wrinkles are not a bad thing. They show character. Yeah. Good save, okay. So 1758, by my count, that's roughly, now I don't know exactly where this cookie came from. If this cookie came from 4 or 5 feet off the ground, it could take an oak 25, 30 years just to get that high. So that's my count, and it gets harder to count. Some of these, as I'm going to tell you in a moment, are really hard to count. And then 2016 is the youngest one for this particular tree. There we go. What do you think this might represent? So we see there's kind of this like really tight banding right in here. Drought? There is a drought. That is a drought. That is a very infamous drought that some of you might remember. Maybe not remember, but you might have experienced.
Early 1900s.
This is the Dust Bowl. This is the Dust Bowl of the 1920s into the 30s. And you can see that for us, as modern Minnesotans, that is a historical drought. Now, looking at this tree cookie, is there any other droughts that you can see?
About a foot more last.
Yeah, you've got, I believe this is in the neighborhood of the 60s, and then you have the droughts of the late 80s, early 90s, and here, there's a bigger one, though. Right here. So there's the Dust Bowls. This one right here is 10 years or something like that. This is about 25 years. And they are right next to each other. I am talking, you have to get a magnifying glass to see the rings. What happened there? Does anybody know?
What year was that?
I didn't tell you a year. This is pre-European settlement in Minnesota. And it's a pretty significant date. In this year, it was known as the year without a summer in New England, where they had snow in the crops in July. Oh, one in the back.
Might be related to some kind of volcanic activity.
There you go. This is the eruption of Tambora. Tambora is a volcano in the South Pacific. It's an equatorial volcano. And it erupted. It's a supervolcano, so think Yellowstone. It erupted, and it literally changed the climate for 15, 20 years to the point that there was snow in the summer. And you can see that recorded clear as day in these tree rings. And this tree was hurting. And if this tree was hurting, think about the people that lived on the land. What happened in 1820? Fort Snelling. Fort Snelling, the native population signed the agreement for Fort Snelling and then the subsequent land treaties for giving away their land. And think about how that affected the native people. In 1815, if you had 5 years of really difficult years of hunting and survival, you're going to be a much more susceptible to some other group coming in and trying to take your things. So right there on this tree, we see the ecological history of the land, but we also can relate it to the history of the people on that land. And that right there is a story. There's another one here that I had to do some research for, and that's, where is it? Back in here, I believe. In 1790, there was another extraordinary drought. So that's back to back within about 30 years, 2 extraordinary droughts happening on this land in very short succession.
Question.
Yeah.
Where is this tree from?
It's from White Bear Lake, it was right on Lake Ave, yep. So not too far from that big mound that Sarah was just talking about.
Is this that big burrow you were talking about?
Yep, this is it. So there's a zoom in of the Tambora just to show you kind of just how many rings are there. I mean, it is a significant event in this tree's life. And that goes all the way back to 1815. All right. So moving away from the tree cookie itself, thinking about trees. If we see trees only as a commodity, only as a product for wood or for things like that, we're missing the point in my mind, especially as an environmental science instructor. They record the local history of the land. If you can learn how to read a tree, it tells you its life story. If it's going to grow towards the light, right? So you can see the life history of a tree just by looking at its shape. They also maintain a very accurate record of climate data. And looking at tree rings, we can collect beams from old buildings, and we can look at the tree rings from those beams. And we can go back thousands of years in some cases by finding preserved trees and bogs and such. And we can cross-reference the data with other tree rings. And they're also members of a dynamic community, and that brings me back to my tree project. When we walk by trees, all too often we see just the trees. We don't see that story of the land. We don't see the changes that forest has continually made. So by looking at the types of trees and the ages of trees in a land, we can learn its story, and we can also predict its future. So here is my tree project. They are challenged, and this is no small undertaking. In the middle of winter, they are challenged to determine the density, distribution, age, and species diversity of a local woodlot. So they have to collect an immense amount of data. It takes them about a week just to figure out how to even survey for that amount of data. Like, what are they going to do? How are they going to do it? And then they have to tell the story of 3 stories. They have to tell the story of the land, based on their tree data. They have to tell the story of this individual tree using this tree data. And then they have to tell the story of the people and how the people have interacted with the land. And what they come to realize is that the tree serves as a historical reference for the people, but I also invite elders from the community. Mayor Judd Marshall, I invite him into my classroom so he tells his oral history of Matamidai. And it's that oral history that really strikes the students. And that's the piece that is lost. If we talk about Native communities, most of their history was passed down orally. And the only remnants we have of that are whatever people wrote down or what's recorded through what we know about the actual physical history of the land. So there's Mayor Judd Marshall in my classroom. This is probably, this project about 3/4 of the way through is where I always hear this from a student. Why don't we ever talk about this stuff? They always think Minnesota started like 1850. They go to the Washington County Historical Society and everything's 1850 and more recent. What happened to the previous 10,000 years? Why do we spend so much time on the 150 years? And every year, a student, they realize they're missing this whole history of Minnesota that we never talk about because we spend so much time focusing on 1850 and on. So they realize that Minnesota certainly did not start in 1849, that these trees and this land has been around in its, whatever its current state is, as a result of 10,000 or 12,000 years worth of history. That 10,000, 12,000 is the reason there was about a mile of ice here about 12,000 years ago. It was like Antarctica. And then looking at those trees to predict something about the future. If we start looking at Matamidi as a community, how is our ecological community changing, and how is the human community affecting that ecological change? So now my students are engaging with history. They're understanding the history of the land, the history of the people, but they're also engaging with the history of the community, the ecological community of which they are a part. So they are no longer seeing themselves as apart from the forest, but they are a part of and they are responsible for the structure of the forest as it stands. With that, I'd like to thank you for being such a good audience. There they are learning how to survey trees. I do want to spend a couple of seconds if there are any questions about either the tree cookie, about the tree cookies on your tables. If you have any questions for me, because I do have to go back because I have more classes to teach.
Are the tree cookies on the table from branches off the same mother oak?
No, these are from a red oak up in Forest Lake. So these are from a red oak. These different oak. That's bur oak. This is a red oak. Yep.
Is any of this information being shifted upward to leaders in the community, governors, et cetera, about the history of the tree and looking at this and maybe doing more with kids, more with adults?
I would love to start that conversation. I have my small teacher groups that I try to share with, but I think it's hard when you have something that's irreplaceable like this. I have talked to people at the University of Minnesota in the dendrochronology lab, and they can take high-resolution pictures and they can record the tree rings and then make that digitally available. They actually have a project that's open access where you can see tree rings from a ton of bur oaks throughout the Twin Cities area. That's one of the projects they're working on.
I guess I'm thinking too of the diversity of peoples that are coming to the land and here, and we give them the history that's here, and then they can share their history or where they're from, and you've got more of an understanding of how they're distancing.
Yeah, equity is the underlying tone of this project. It doesn't seem like it's there, but when you start looking at trees and the community and the diversity that's there and that they need that diversity, definitely in my classroom I see that as an opportunity to talk about equity, but also an opportunity for students who might not find success in other ways as an access point to get in there. But yeah, I opened this project with a TED Talk all about equity. Yeah, in the front here. It's my mom. Hi, Mom.
You pointed as the last tree ring on your diagram as being out here. Is it there or is it right here?
So yeah, if you look at your tree cookies, look at the bark. The bark actually has growth rings as well, and that bark is kind of the reflection of the tree cookie rings. The bark then falls off, just like our dead skin sloughs off. The bark has tree rings as well. So the outermost ring on the wood is the oldest tree ring. The rest is just in the bark.
I'm curious, what age are your students?
They're mostly juniors and seniors, so 16 to 18-ish. Maybe I have one more question? Okay. Couple more questions? Around the corner.
Well, have you done any research or any study? There's a huge tree ring that I'm familiar with on the north side of South Shore Drive, like between McKnight and Highway 61. It was there since I moved to White Bear Lake. I mean, the tree was there in the early 80s, and I don't know exactly when it came down, but there's a huge, to this day, that's still kind of about a foot thick on its side.
Yeah, it looks kind of like a bison, I think. I think it looks like a bison. It looks like a big hump, yeah.
I don't know what kind of tree it was, but my memory's not real good, but initially when it was taken down, I think someone did some dating on it or something.
That would be an interesting one to take a look at, because if it's an oak, then it's got some stories to tell.
I'm not sure. I mean, it's really kind of deteriorating because it's outside now, but it's
Yeah.
still there.
Mary Jane said there's a cottonwood. That would be my first guess with a tree of that size. Cottonwoods, they live fast, die young. So a big, huge cottonwood, 80 years old. I mean,
Cottonwoods in that area.
yeah. Any other questions?
How was that tree removed, the bur oak, and who managed it and where did it go?
It fell down in a storm. in June of 2016, and it was preserved very graciously, and we were lucky enough to get a slice of a tree.
By whom? Who preserved?
It was our tree, and it didn't really fall down because of a storm. We'd had a lot of rain. Now, as he indicated, it's a bur oak, and bur oaks have tap roots. They don't, not like other trees that spread their roots out this way. It had a big tap root. Tap root, I meant to say. In any event, the soil got so soft where the taproot was that the wind pressured the other side of the tree, which doesn't show in any photographs, but it was much bigger, bigger spread on it, and it pulled that taproot right out of the ground. So that's why it went down.
It was on a bank.
On a bank there.
And the bur oaks, they say for every foot of tree you see above the ground, they have roots going down about that deep as well for bur oaks. In the back.
I was wondering, when in the winds, you get a lot of branches that fall off trees. Can you learn something from those?
Absolutely. That's a good segue for some shameless propaganda for my class in February 21st. If you would like to attend that, I will teach you how to read branches as well. Yeah, in the front, the red hat.
Why is these tree rings are dark brown where the insides are beige? Will these fade over time?
That's the bark.
But you said the tree ring was out there.
Right, that's the bark ring. If you look at your tree cookies, the bark makes tree rings, so that's bark rings. And then where the lighter starts, that's the actual wood from the tree itself. So these tree rings move this way, but these tree rings, like the newest bark ring would be on the closest side to the wood, whereas the oldest bark ring would be on the outside. So it's an inverse of the wood. The oldest ones slough off and fall off, but the newest ones are right on that cambium layer, so that layer where the tree's actually alive. All right. Thank you very much. And now to Rob.
Everyone. My legal name is Rob Thomas. I'm the executive director over at Lakeshore Players Theater in White Bear Lake. But my spiritual name, given to me by my kunchi, Margaret Keto, is Wokiksuyeyu Hamani. And that means in Dakota, walks with memories. And she gave me this name after I began conducting extensive research into my family's history. So my journey to find out, and I thank you for allowing me to come today and share my family's story, but my journey to find out more about my family started actually when I left Minnesota. After college, I moved down to Florida. I left Minnesota, what my ancestors used to call Minnesota Makoche, which means the land where the water reflects the sky, or the clouds. After college, I went down to an internship, and I was struck by how quickly I started to feel that disconnect between myself and my family and the land that my family had been on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that brought forth in me very suddenly almost the need to figure out more about the history and the culture that I used to ignore and even worse at times pretend didn't exist. Because of my lighter complexion, I could pretend when I was in school that I wasn't Native American. And people didn't know I was until my grandma came to conferences with me, and then they all saw this little old Indian lady with me dragging behind her. As a side note, my cousins call me the Windian because I look so white, the white Indian. But my grandmother was born on the Santee Sioux Tribe of Nebraska Reservation, and her family was one of the first Dakota families to return to Minnesota after their exile. That's all I really knew about my family history, and I suddenly needed to know more. So after moving back to Minnesota, I began to contact some of the elders in my family and found out that they had started a good chunk of the research. In a lot of Native American families, you'll hear that in the 50s and the 60s, they just sort of pretended they weren't, and they tried to fit in with white culture because it was a lot harder to be a Native American. It was a lot easier to be white. You hear a lot of families that say, oh, we're Italian. We're not Native American, we're Italian. And kids don't even find out that they're Native American until later on, and they know nothing of their history. Well, my family, to combat that, had started doing some of this research, and as did, very recently, forward-thinking organizations like the Minnesota Historical Society, which had started acknowledging Minnesota's genocidal past, and were actually publishing books on it that didn't include the term the Sioux Uprising, which was the title of a book from the Historical Society Press in 1976. So it was called the Sioux Uprising, and then we started to learn a little more about it. We called it the Dakota Conflict, and now we're using the more correct term, the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, or as my family insists on calling it, the Dakota-U.S. War. So I began visiting historical sites in the Gale Family Library at the Minnesota History Center so often that the staff started to know me by name and subject. They'd see me walk in and they'd get some things ready for me. I took a month one summer to visit each significant site of the Dakota-U.S. War: the Ramsey House, the Battle of Birch Coulee, Fort Ridgely, Fort Snelling, Lac Qui Parle Mission, Lower Sioux Agency, Traverse des Sioux, all of these, New Ulm, all of these incredible sites where substantial history of my family took place. In fact, I'm going to share a quick story about my trip to New Ulm, if that's okay, just because I had heard rumors in my family that at one point in a Chinese restaurant they said there was a plaque that had something to do with the U.S.-Dakota War, and they said it had it had a strange writing on it, but nobody could remember where it was, and nobody could find it. So I went to New Ulm one day, and I started going to I started at the Chinese restaurant that no longer existed, and they had no idea what I was talking about. So I went over to their little museum they had and talked, and someone there said, yeah, I think I heard something about that. Check, it's maybe a bank or an insurance company or something like that. So I went downtown and started going to each bank and insurance company and asking if I could go in their basement, which didn't work well in some places and worked just, can I get in the vault, please? No. So, when I walked into an office and a woman said, I know where that is, that's next door, in the basement next door. So she took me over and we went down in the basement, and sitting on the floor, leaning against the original stone foundation of the building, was a plaque that said, during the Indian massacre, this building was the refuge for the women and children. Powder with fuse was stored in the basement, and it was intended to blow up the building should the Sioux gain possession of the town. So that was a plaque that I went and found and took a picture of, asked if I could have it, and they said no. Thought I'd ask. And all along my journey, I was able to find great stories like that. In each and every stop, there was history at each stop I made. I took trips down to Santee, Nebraska, to the reservation, and took recordings of all the oral history my elders could remember. As Sarah mentioned, there wasn't a lot of documented history. The Dakota didn't have a writing, even. They didn't have a language, a written language, until the late 1800s when missionaries helped them started translating some of that. I went on to South Dakota to visit my relatives in Crow Creek, in Flandreau, Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Sisseton, Wahpeton, Standing Rock, and Yankton, just trying to get as much information as I can. And unfortunately, you hear a lot when you make these stops, well, Uncle so-and-so could have told us more, but he's gone now. And Aunt so-and-so could have told us more, but she's gone now. So it became very important to me to start documenting some of these histories that weren't written down anywhere, and that unfortunately, as the elders started passing away, we started losing some of that history. That documented history combined with the oral history from my family members helped me to find out the following. My great-great-great-grandfather, Maza Adidi, which means walks on iron, was born into Red Legs Band, which was a division of the Wahpekute, a village on the Minnesota River near present-day Mankato. He married a woman named Paja Hiayoin, which is translated to, she radiates in her path like the sun. And they had several young children when Maza Adidi went off to fight in the Dakota-U.S. War. When the war was inevitably lost, Maza Adidi was one of several hundred Dakota men to be tried by military tribunal and sentenced to hang. His trial lasting less than 3 minutes, according to the trial transcripts, which are still intact today at the Minnesota History Center. He was sentenced to death along with over 300 other men. his sentence was eventually commuted to serving prison time in a stockade in Davenport, Iowa. 38 other men were not so lucky and were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota, in the largest mass execution to take place on U.S. soil still to date. And I'm going to share with you a couple of the trial transcripts so you can hear just how short some of the trials were. This is the trial of somebody who was sentenced to death, had his sentence commuted, and ended up being pardoned in 1866. This was at Camp Sibley in Lower Sioux Agency, Minnesota. The witness said, "I saw the defendant at the fort and a New Ulm with a gun, running about with other Indians." The Dakota said, "I was at the fort, but not at New Ulm. I didn't fire at anyone. I was at Wood Lake, but didn't fire." And then the next line is from the judge. "The commission finds the prisoner guilty as charged. The prisoner is sentenced to hang by the neck until dead." And that's the full transcript. Another one, Dakota. "I didn't fire at the fort. I was there and got my arm broken before I could fire." The witness said, "After the fight at the fort was over, I went down the hill near a spring with a mare I had taken out of the stables, and the prisoner told me to give it up, and I was afraid, and I gave it up. I saw him have a gun there." And then the next line is, "The commission finds the prisoner guilty as charged. The prisoner is sentenced to hang by the neck until dead." Luckily, this person's sentence was also commuted. Sorry. This is the trial transcript for somebody who was actually hanged in Mankato. "I am not guilty. I have been in 3 battles. I have stolen horses, and I tell you I fired at white men only in battle." A witness, "I heard him say to another Indian that Richardson was coming on horseback, and they shot him off his horse and wounded him, and then tried to get some news. And after they got it, they shot him dead. The prisoner shot him. I heard him say so." And then this commission finds the prisoner guilty as charged. This prisoner is sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. So this is literally the transcripts from the trial. These were the tribunals that took place. They were all incredibly short. Most of the Dakotas didn't speak the language. They had intermediaries speaking for them. A lot of the witnesses were the same person. You'll see the names of the witnesses. Same person was a witness in a lot of the trials. So that was probably the most impactful thing to hear, is just how quickly we were willing to perpetuate Ramsey's. He said at one point, the Indians must be exterminated or driven from the borders of these lands, essentially, and we were willing to do that way. Pajai Yayawin was forced march from November 7th to November 13th in weather similar to now, with her 3 children, some other families' children, and someone referred to as the old lady, and we don't know who that is, but she was traveling with her. They were marched 150 miles from the Lower Sioux Agency in Morton, Minnesota, to the concentration camp built to hold them on the banks just below Fort Snelling. They marched them through the cities that battles had taken place and allowed the settlers to do to them as they pleased. And there are some graphic examples from the diary of a soldier that marched with them, but I'll spare the details and just say over 200 of them died or were killed on the march and during their incarceration at Fort Snelling. Amazingly, my family survived, and despite Mazadidi serving his sentence in Davenport, Iowa, he was sentenced to hang, but he had his sentence commuted. And Pajai Yayawin's transfer by riverboat to a reservation in North Dakota, they managed to find each other and finally settled in a newly created reservation in Santee, Nebraska. And that's where my grandmother was born. In more recent history, as I said, her family was one of the first Dakota families to return to Minnesota, where it is still legally, Dakotas are still exiled. There's still a law on the books today that says that Dakotas cannot be within the borders of Minnesota that are tied to some treaty rights issues, so it's never been overturned, but it's actual law that says that technically I can't be here today. Her brother was one of the first, he was either the 6th or the 8th, I'm sorry, I can't remember, Native Americans to graduate from the University of Minnesota. And why is this important, and why do I like to share this story? All of it comes down to acknowledgement. When I go and I talk to people about my family history, And when other people talk about their family history, they're not looking for pity, and they're not looking for you to take responsibility or anyone to take responsibility, or my other side of the family to take responsibility for the atrocities committed and the genocide committed. All they're looking for, in most cases, is a level of acknowledgement, because only after we acknowledge our genocidal past can the people who are affected by it heal. And when I say the people affected by it, I don't just mean people from the indigenous community. Everybody in Minnesota is affected by that. The Dakota had a deep connection with the land, and after they were exiled, we lost a lot of that connection. We started to see the land as a commodity, as a resource, as opposed to a living thing that we live in harmony with. And that's why it's important for me to share this story. I'm happy now to answer any questions. I will say I don't consider myself a Native American historian. I've done a lot of history on my family and thus have gotten a lot of information about the Dakota in Minnesota. But if anyone has any questions, I'll certainly try to answer it for you.
Programming for the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society is made possible through the generous donations from our patrons and visitors. Your tax-deductible gift goes directly towards future programming, community outreach, and education. Monetary donations can easily be made online at whitebearhistory.org. Please help us to continue to save history, and thank you so much for your support.